I choose a book of poetry as the book of the year. It's sort of like the Susan Elizabeth Howe Award. And my book of poetry for this year is this book, Zorba's Daughter by Elisabeth Murawski, our reader today. What that means is I will promote this book all year. I will use it in my classes. I will tell everyone I meet that they should read this. I will give copies to all my poet friends. I think this is a fantastic book of poetry. And I recommend very highly that if you buy no other book of poetry this year, you buy this one. It's really a fine book. So that's my little pitch. Now, to tell you a little bit about our guest, Elisabeth Murawski, she holds a Master of Fine Arts from George Mason University, and she's a very well-published poet. She's been awarded a Hawthornden Fellowship, which means that she got the opportunity to write for a month at Hawthornden Castle in Scotland. Other honors include residencies at the Helene Wurlitzer Foundation and the Vermont Studio Center and the, I don't even know how to pronounce this, Achille Heinrich Bull Association. She's the author of the collection Moon and Mercury and 2 chapbooks, Troubled by an Angel and Outpatients, and she has won this year's 2010 May Swenson Poetry Award. That's what this collection was prepared for. Her poems have appeared in the very best journals. She's published more than 200 poems in journals, including Yale Review, New Republic, Virginia Quarterly Review, Field, Southern Review, and other really outstanding places to publish poetry. She's also been a finalist, in addition to this contest, which she has won, she's also been a finalist in the Field, for the Field Poetry Prize, the Brittenham and Pollock Poetry Prize, the Blue Links Prize, and the Journal OSU Prize for Poetry. I like to think of reading a poem as going on a little journey, that you trust the poet to take you someplace. Sometimes it's like a roller coaster ride, and sometimes you enter into a whole new world and a whole new landscape, and then you come out changed on the other side. And that's what I think Elisabeth Murawski's poems are like. Each poem is a journey, and in each journey, there is a dislocation into a new place. Though you seem to be going so carefully and so easily there that you're not aware how dislocated you are until you all of a sudden sit up and are surprised. Christopher Howell said, Elisabeth Murawski's poems find their way into unexpected, inexplicable rooms, where what you thought you knew has left directions for its burial. She is a lyric compressionist of the first order and full of dark surprises. And DeJule Marbrook has said, Elisabeth Murawski's clarity in Zorba's Daughter reassures me again and again that I can adjust to the speed and targeting of her images and ideas. He uses the notion of the journey too. I see the stations flying past me, the stations of her journey. I know that unlike a passenger on a train, I am not obliged to adjust. I can slow this train down, but I am disinclined because I trust the poet's clarity to show me what I am supposed to see as I am supposed to see it. This is not Impressionism with its fast first glance limpidity, nor is it Surrealism with its dislocatory impulse. This is an intellectual innocence, a guilelessness that makes me fear for the poet's sanity. Well, I think the poet's a very sane poet, and Marbrook also says, Murawski is a dangerous poet, and therefore one of the best. And although that is surprising for such a fine, nice woman as she is, I think she's a dangerous poet too. The last thing I would add is from A.E. Stallings, who says, I would call these dry-eyed, uncompromising poems dark, but they are shot through with light. And I think that's where this book will take you. It is our pleasure to welcome Elisabeth Murawski today. Thank you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Susan. And thanks to the Utah Humanities Council for organizing this kind of trip for me to come out here and read for you. I read at Utah State yesterday, and tomorrow I'll be at the Salt Lake City Humanities Council readings. I'm going to read a poem that goes back to my childhood in Chicago, where I was born and raised, and it's called Before the Air Became the Journey. It is Good Friday, and I am 7. I don't understand the priest who speaks in Latin or in Polish, but I like the hopeful smell of candles burning. Inching forward on our knees, we sway and shuffle towards the giant crucifix propped at the railing. The men's heads are bare, the women wear babushkas. Everywhere I look, there are soles of shoes. My turn. I stand and stretch to reach the bleeding instep. An altar boy wipes away my kiss with a white handkerchief. I bow my head to imitate the old man who on Sundays stays for all the masses, locked in place at the altar rail, face buried in his hands, hunched over and sad, as if, like me, he'd done everything wrong. Someone like him, I think, could stop the nails from going in. This next poem is called The Fish, and the reference to Lake Como is not to the Lake Como in Italy. It's a small, muddy lake about 5 miles from Lake Geneva in Wisconsin. We used to go there for vacations. The fish. Wide as my body, half as tall, the fish lolled under a rowboat tied to the pier. Its movements, had the water been air, like a fat Chinese kite's hovering. In a movie, sinister music might have played, finding such a fish, groan of cellos and basses. But then there was only the hot summer silence of the afternoon, gripped at random by a dog's distant barking. The fish's belly was yellowed by the sunlit water. I couldn't see its head. Distracted by a dive-bombing dragonfly, I turned just for a second, then looked back. The fish was gone, the brown gold water, empty as a shrine of a god no longer prayed to. I decided not to tell. Who'd believe me anyway? A fish that huge in muddy Lake Como. My secret then, to pull up through the years, symbol of all I saw and didn't want to see. This next poem has a reference to a Catholic saint, Maria Goretti, who was assaulted and killed as a result of the stab wounds she received. And then there's another reference in it to Mussolini, who was called Il Duce. The title is Frightened by Italy. This prowling place of dark wine and lilies has no ceiling, leaves a trail of broken cameras. Where is Francis and his bleeding son? The upside-down Il Duce swings and swings a bitter incense. Titian paints himself into yet another crucifixion scene. The little Goretti girl, who wore nothing special to her murder, fell ripe as a blood orange to the molester's knife. The earth shifts in place. Rage rivers out and preserves at the dinner table all those family members, homely as grape leaves, stamping out life. About 10 or 12 years ago, I went on a trip to North Carolina's Outer Banks, where the Hatteras Lighthouse is a famous site. And I had climbed it on visits there before, probably a total of about 3 times that I've done it. The last time I did it, it took a lot out of me, and I don't think I could do it again. But this poem is about that experience. Hatteras Lighthouse. We laugh and pant for our hearts pushed this far, each step harder than the last, the air close and humid, so that our hair clings to our necks, and we gasp, forced to stop at landings on the spiral to a man-made moon. Each window leaks a draft of cool, reveals a scrap of blue tempting us up. We pull back against the wall, stall for earlier climbers who, descending, barely touch an elbow or a sleeve, brush past the life we hold. Kissed by bracing chill at the final door opening, we stare at the drop, the knots of shrunken tourists on the beach. The waves do their prehistoric two-step, shuffle and glide, die and die again, wind-tossed, noisy but solemn. The moves, classy as a model's, swinging her long legs down the runway, reminiscent of that halt, moth on a pin, to woo the audience, before she pivots, charming in reverse, then lopes backstage into the darkness she came from, tearing off her clothes in a frenzy to meet the next allée. That idea of the waves connected to models, I wanted to contrast by reading a poem from Mae Swenson, where she compares the waves to, and the movement of the sea to cattle. She writes a short poem called The Even Sea. Meekly, the sea now plods to shore, white-faced cattle used to their yard. The waves with weary knees come back from bouldered hills of high water, where all the gray, rough day they seethed like bulls, till the wind laid down its goads at shift of tide, and sundown gentled them. With lowered necks, they amble up the beach as to their stalls. I just love that one. And then while I was at the Outer Banks, one of the other poems that came out of that visit was a visit to an Elizabethan garden in Roanoke. It's a lovely place to be. I think the live oak tree is supposed to be 400 years old, and it's full of statues and that kind of thing. An Elizabethan garden. Stone deities guard the fountain in the sunken garden with its table and benches, beds of petunias purple as Lent. Minerva is whole, so are Jupiter and Diana, but a vandal's hammer has left Apollo, sexless as Abelard, pouting Venus half-scalped and inconsolable. Beyond the fountain, a live oak leans parallel to the lawn. Hints of rainbow escape from trunks of crepe myrtles. Near the water, the gazebo thatched with reeds, the air swarms with gnats, restless as thought, as a striped lizard skittering on gravel, obsessed with transport. The magnolia's one stunning blossom calls, "Notice me," insistent as a mourning dove. If you've seen the cover of the book, it's a sculpture of a flute player by Camille Claudel, who was a French sculptor, lover of Rodin, who's also known for The Thinker, is probably his most famous sculpture. After they had a relationship, after it broke up, she had more or less a nervous breakdown. Today, she might have been treated for bipolar disease or some kind of mental illness, but at that time, they just put her in a madhouse. And her brother and mother committed her there, and she lived there for the rest of her life, something like 30 years. So I wanted to honor her by writing various poems, and one of them is in this book. And a nice kind of gift to me was that in trying to get the rights for the picture on the cover, I had to contact Claudel's great-grandniece, and she's still alive in Paris, and she wrote to me and gave permission. So that's why the picture is there. And then when the book came out, I sent her a copy in gratitude, and she wrote back in French and thanked me for doing that. So that was a very special thing that came out of choosing that sculpture for the cover. The poem is called Camille Claudel at Large. At least a foot of confetti hides the floor. Streamers whisper and gossip, an ocean to walk through. So deep a confession wrung from lipless flutes. A city buried with debris. I raise my hands, charismatic, looking back to a mind clear and smooth, untroubled by spirits who would be my clock to breathe by. No one answers, pours champagne. I pray in stone. Study the maquette I would transform. I could lead it under stars small as eyeglass screws. Stars do not judge or condemn. Do not sit on my shoulder like an unforgiving parrot biting my ear. A red streamer sticks to my shoe, a blue. This next poem is also about a French woman, Coco Chanel, the designer, clothes designer. She was exiled to Switzerland after the war was over, because after World War II was over, I have to remember with a younger audience here, the war to me meant World War II. After the war was over, she was condemned by the people in popular opinion because she'd had this relationship with a German officer during the occupation. And she came back mainly through the influence, I understand, of Winston Churchill, who, because she was a famous person, got her permission to come back to Paris. So Richard Avedon, the photographer, took a picture of her in the streets under posters that were really, the juxtaposition of putting her body under these particular posters was very ironic. But she didn't see it. She was older and maybe just didn't catch on. Maybe she was just too happy to be back. She didn't notice, and after the photograph was made, she never saw it, and it wasn't published till after her death. So you'll hear more about what happened. It's called The Trap. It's been years since Beaten and Vogue. Her coming as a tree to the forest ball. Upper body swathed in leaves, face a mask of black powder. In her element before the lens, Chanel's oblivious to the frame Avedon puts her in. Posters plastered on the walls, behind and overhead, like a blade. Pourquoi Hitler? To her left, Lady Liberty stares beyond the swirling slogan of the barricades at a far, far better thing. Avedon knows about her handsome German officer, the affair post-war Paris can't forget. Spared the shaved head of collaborators, she was not led naked through the streets. A brief arrest and then released to Swiss exile. She welcomes this respite from quarantine, chooses an outfit of jet, its collar white as a nun's, tucks a triple rope of pearls under the belt. In a hat whose splash of brooch suggests a cockade, Chanel at 65 still exudes the style she stole from England. Elegant, she wrote, that is, detached. The photo's not released until she's dead. By then, the irony of woman, wall, and slogans juxtaposed has lost its edge. The young see an aging celebrity whose long, thin neck is turning sinewy, her expression triste, resigned, the white-gloved hand holding a cigarette going to ash, slightly lifted, extended as if in benediction or to be kissed. Some of you may have heard of or been to the Benedictine Chapel in New Mexico that is out in the desert near the Ghost Ranch. Georgia O'Keeffe, when she lived out there, used to go there because the chapel is very modern and stark. It's not typical of what you consider a Catholic church look. And she had once confessed that it tempted her to become a Catholic. I thought that was interesting. So this poem is called The Chapel That Tempted O'Keeffe to Become a Catholic. A white linen throw, homely as a blank canvas, tops the square altar stone, large enough to pin down Isaac. Did the artist rejoice in the weave? Did the woman recall the child she lived without? Two wrought iron candle holders curve like horns of doubt on the lectern made of driftwood. Raindrops like fingertips tap in code. No hiding here from the wilderness. Christ dies again in a sky blue loincloth. Unstained, the windows weep and blur the red hills. So that I won't be accused of only talking about women artists. This one is about a sculpture by Douglas Tilden. He was deaf from an early age and learned to become a sculptor later on. And I guess he was born here in the United States, but went to Europe to study sculpture. And I know nothing about him. In fact, I have to write his name down because I tend to forget it. He's not well known. But in the Smithsonian, there's one of his sculptures. It's a man's arm with a shirt sleeve and a hand out. And he's balancing a baby on his hand. And the sculpture is called The Young Acrobat. So that inspired the following poem. Sculpture, The Young Acrobat. From a rolled up sleeve, one strong arm thrust the baby high with a force not unlike a birth, the push away from home, familiar seas. Aloft, the infant leans forward on air as if to ask, why am I here? The ground's a long way down. Naked he lies there, his sex masked by a patch of cloth, pawn of a hand's skill, nimble toes curled under. His tiny fingers separate the index of the left hand and the little finger of the right, slightly raised as if about to grasp what appears beyond his reach. His mother, perhaps, who may also be an artist of the ring, leaping on and off a horse's back, somersaulting to a waltz, twirling by her hair or her teeth. Helpless to wend his way to her arms, he must bear the thrill of heights, the smell of fear, the seed of wanting more than feeling safe. This danger his to claim, balanced in a father's hand, eyes on hold, learning to be perfectly still. Next couple of poems also come out of the World War II experience. I was a little kid during that time, and my experience of it was family members leaving to go overseas, and my brother was in Asia. But there were also, after the war, so many pictures and newsreels and movie houses of what was going on there. And when you're little, those things scare you much more than they would when you were older. Not just diminish it, but it stays with you. This one is about Nagasaki, the aftermath, and I happened to see a photograph of a woman holding her baby after the blast had occurred. It isn't clear whether the baby's alive or not. Small fires, Nagasaki. The wind, when it comes, is warm. There is no home that isn't leveled or burning. She barely feels the tug on her nipple or sees the blue-white dribble on her baby's chin, his swollen belly, the one tree left standing, its trunk and branches a Y incision, its few leaves whispering like witches. Leaning by itself on the sky, the gate of the temple resembles pi, an irrational number. Small fires flicker. Empty, she lets him suckle the child in her arms, who may die or live without her. And this one's about the gypsy children in Europe, in Germany, Poland, that whole area. you don't hear too much about the Gypsy children. And I was in Vermont on a fellowship a few years back, and their library had a copy of a book for young adults on Anne Frank. And I picked it up, and it was pictorial biography, but it had a lot of things about the war, and it was explaining the whole scene to younger readers. And one of the pictures was of these children, the Gypsy children, being rounded up and taken by the nun. So I wrote this poem then. It's called Lullaby of the Train. With eyes like empty begging bowls, the orphan gypsy girls have stopped complaining of shoes that pinch their toes, of dresses with holes. The town clock releases a knight on horseback, announces the hour. The children can't tell time yet. Numbers on paper, they shuffle forward, too weary and hungry to cry or look back. The German nun waves to her charges, obedient as shadows. Click-clack go the wheels, kissing the railroad track, lullaby of the train. Click-clack, click-clack to this smoky town in Poland. I live in Alexandria, where there are lots of mourning doves. I don't know if they have them out here, but they do in my little section of Alexandria. And having been raised in Chicago and maybe not paying attention to birds, I didn't know anything about them, but they're very much around my neighborhood. And so this poem is a little bit about them. There's a reference to the Iceman in here. That's a mummy that was found in Europe that's supposedly like 3,300 years old. And they found him with his shoes with straw inside. Apparently that had lasted because it was all in a glacier all that time. Mourning doves. They sound freshly wounded, weeping their few cracked notes. Lullaby to the fly in the web, the torn gazelle, the Iceman with grass in his shoes, fighting sleep on the glacier. Listen, they chorus, here is the underlying sorrow of the world. In the belly, in the rock, in the black holes of heaven and the sea. The party, drunk with melancholy, would have loved the North American mourning doves, cooing where their treasure is. He'd have warmed to their solemnity, their blink and croon, charmed by the light of dying stars. I visited Paris for the first time about 12 years ago, and in taking the high-speed train, I'd never been on one before. I was headed for Vendôme to visit people that I'd never met before who were friends of friends, told me to get in touch with them. And while I was on the train, I saw this woman, and I don't know if you're familiar with the paintings of Cézanne, but he has done a number of his wife, Hortense, and portraits of her. And this woman looked so much like her. I kept looking, and of course, this is 100 years after she died, I guess. But I decided I was going to write about that, and I took some notes, I think, at the time. On the high-speed train to Vendôme, I see a woman who looks like Madame Cézanne. I try not to stare. She leans back and closes her eyes, brows plucked, no lipstick, bare throat and lobes, jewels enough. The train starts, will glide from Paris to Vendôme in less than an hour, silken and smooth as a limo. I think of Chopin, frail in coaches, Toussaint and Noah and back again, the jolting murderess. Would he trade centuries? Meanwhile, my lady sleeps, and I am struck again by the resemblance to Hortense, her hands clasped neatly in her lap as Madame posed for Paul in the conservatory. Fields of yellow rape stream by, the horizon jagged with steeples. Near Vendome, she jerks awake, rises to expose the full streak of leopard print sweatsuit. Balancing in the aisle, she's a cypress blown in X, covered from neck to ankle with splotches of black and gold. Her priceless leopard self, unfinished, but perfectly realized. I want to, before we open up for questions, I wanted to read the epigraph, two epigraphs actually, to the book from Nikos Kazantzakis' the book Zorba the Greek. I actually hadn't read the book before I wrote the poem Zorba's Daughter, which is, I think, maybe 5 or 6 years old, the poem itself. But I had seen the movie, and I had remembered Zorba saying things like, the full catastrophe of living, and what do you do but dance when you can't handle life? And so I decided to read the book. And when I did, there were a couple of things that came out at me that seemed to be what was going on in my book, the two different sort of threads of, well, you see from the reading here. The first one is, when everything goes wrong, what a joy to test your soul and see if it has endurance and courage. An invisible and all-powerful enemy, some call him God, others the devil, seems to rush upon us to destroy us, but we are not destroyed. And the second one is, I felt deep within me that the highest point a man can attain is not knowledge or virtue or goodness or victory, but something even greater, more heroic and despairing, sacred awe. So I'll read Zorba's Daughter. Night boasted it was eternity, but here now through the brown links of trees the sun spills dawn. Lights turn, dice on a table to be eternal, a current to feed her house, abruptly wake her like a thief. Who will teach her divine collaboration? Who will love her dirty hands enough to leave her head unshaved? She goes barefoot as the sky, nectarine slice on a spoon, sweet coral carnation, little fish with wings in her heart, tempted to fly from the spear she cannot escape, resolved to die like Samson, braced against the pillars of the temple, roaring for his eyes. And I think I have time to read one last poem, which is not in this book, but I think it's an important poem to get as large an audience as possible. And it was inspired by an article in the New Yorker about Abu Ghraib and the torture that was done there. The article was titled A Deadly Interrogation. The poem refers to the Isenheim altarpiece, which is an altarpiece in Germany of the crucifixion, and it was done by Grunwald, a German painter. I believe he was 15th or 16th century Germany. The title is Abu Ghraib Suggests the Isenheim Altarpiece. Arms behind him, shackled to the wall, Jamadi's knees buckle. He lands on air. Let us reposition him to stand erectly, Homo sapiens. Place the irons higher up on the window bars. When again he falls forward, hangs like Jesus from his wrists, call it faking, possum playing, persist. Lift him up on legs that ragdoll sag into a third collapse, the effect grotesque as Grunwald's Christ, bones about to pop from their sockets. The silence curious, raise the hood that hid a face, asphyxiation, wag a finger past the eyes. It has begun, the turning of the skin to purple, the indigo of Tyre and Sidon. Note, as he's lowered to the floor, the stunning rush of blood from nose and mouth, the Red Sea. In this heat, let us blur the time of death, pack the flesh in ice, like fish or meat, pretend he's merely sick, hooked to an IV, a patient on a stretcher. Destroy the crime scene. Throw away the bloodied hood. It stings with the quality of mercy. As far as I know, nothing's been done to rectify that situation. Thank you.